Very good evening to all of you. On behalf of Committee for Members in Practice of Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, I welcome you all in today's VCM on issues in tax audit and accounting and auditing considerations in InvIT and REIT. In order to tackle this, we are having two eminent speakers, Sri Amit Gupta ji and Sri Sandeep Dinodia ji. And it is our proud privilege that Karnal branch has given their kind consent to host this program. So we are having with us the Honorable Chairman of Karnal branch, as well as the immediate past chairman of the Karnal branch. So I welcome all of you, sir. Welcome both the speakers, sir. On behalf of Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, I welcome all of you. So I request CA Deepak Kapoor ji, the past chairman of Karnal branch, to please start the proceedings of today's VCM. Deepak, sir.
Thank you, Anil ji. Thank you very much. Very warm good afternoon to everyone. Firstly, I welcome today's guest speaker, CA Sandeep ji and CA Amit Gupta ji on behalf of Karnal branch. And thanks to Committee for Member in Practice for giving this opportunity to Karnal branch to organize this webinar in collaboration with Committee for Member in Practice. I request our worthy chairman Karnal branch, CA Rohit Garg ji, to officially welcome today's guest speaker, CA Sandeep ji and CA Amit Gupta ji on behalf of Karnal branch and introduce our member about the brief profile of today's guest speaker, CA Rohit Garg ji.
Thank you, Deepak sir. Good evening, all of you. And it's a matter of great privilege for me as well as the Karnal branch of NIRC of ICI to host a VCM which is organized by the Committee of Member in Practice of ICI on tax audit and accounting and auditing consideration for InvIT and REIT. And I welcome today's guest speaker, CA Sandeep Dinodia ji, a very eminent speaker on this. So, Mr. Sandeep Dinodia has completed his Bachelor of Commerce from Shri Ram College of Commerce, Delhi University, and his LLB from Delhi University in 1986. He is a FCA from the ICI since 1984. Mr. Dinodia sir is on the board of directors of many large public listed companies as an independent director, offering invaluable guidance on the company's policies of good corporate governance and helping solve their compliance issue with the myriad of laws under SEBI, Companies Act, FEMA, etc. Sir has very vast experience in conducting and supervising the various large audits like statutory, internal audit, tax audit, due diligence audits, etc., etc. He has been instrumental in setting up of various enterprises in India with the collaboration from international association and companies. Mr. Dinodia sir has very rich experience in the field of assurance, regulatory, financial consulting. He is over 20-year experience in the area of practice. He provides valuable insight into how companies can grow, diversify, and prosper to maximize their shareholders' wealth. Sir, I welcome you again on today's VCM, and it's our privilege to be part of this event, and we are eagerly waiting to hear you, sir. I again welcome you, sir. I also welcome today's our another eminent speaker, CA Amit Gupta ji. CA Amit Gupta, Commerce graduate from Shri Ram College of Commerce, University of Delhi. He is a fellow member of ICI with and a partner with SR Bartley and Company LLP. He has 23 years of experience in auditing companies, especially in power and utility, real estate, and infrastructure sector. Amit sir is also the assurance sector leader for power and utility company for his firm nationally. Amit ji is also an eminent speaker and writer at various forums, including with the ICI, CIE, etc. Also, and I also welcome you, sir, on the today's webinar, which is organized by a committee of members in practice. I welcome you, sir. Over to Deepak ji.
Thank you, Rohit ji. Firstly, I request CA Sandeep Dinodia ji, sir, to kindly start today's seminar. CA Sandeep ji.
Thank you so much for all your kind words, and I'm very privileged to be able to address this topic today of tax audit, which is one of the oldest and most read, most used topic in our profession. As we all know, this
रणवीर
tax
जी थोड़ा
audit
सा कैमरा थोड़ा सा yes sir okay.
So, as we all know, this tax audit is something that most of us have done for many years. It keeps changing, it keeps evolving, and we all have to keep abreast of it. There are various case laws that come into operation, there are various interpretations that have come in. So, since 1984 to 2021, tax audit has traveled a long way, both in terms of how we implement tax audit, how SCAs we do tax audit, and how the government looks at our tax audit reports in terms of their facilitating assessment proceedings. So firstly, once again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I will try to bring out some practical aspects, though the tax audit is a very long topic and we can debate on it and discuss it for many hours, and I've been given this time to do it. So what I will do is I will share with you the critical issues which in my opinion are important while filling out the tax audit report, and I will give you some practical examples on how we have dealt with, which are my personal views and the views of our firm, which may not be perfect at the moment, but this is how we are trying to solve the various controversy that arise while conducting the tax audit for us. So with that, I will start with my presentation. Please pardon me because a lot of issues may be not very clear because we are still struggling with the absolutely correct answer, but I will try to give my point of view, justification, and maybe the suggestion that I give will help the members of the institute in filling out these tax audit reports. Thank you. So let me now share with you my small presentation. लेफ्ट साइड जाके मिनिमाइज करते हैं, इसको मिनिमाइज ऊपर और लेफ्ट. So the tax audit came into operation in 84-85 for the first time, and the memorandum explaining the tax audit by the finance minister stated that the compulsory audit is intended to ensure proper maintenance of books of accounts and other records in order to reflect the true income of the taxpayer and to facilitate the administration of tax laws by a proper presentation of accounts before the tax authorities. This would also save time of the assessing officer considerably in carrying out the verification. So it's a very big onus that the government of India placed on our profession to carry out the tax audit, and the whole purpose was the correct assessment to be done by the government in determining the tax liability of every assessee who goes through a tax audit, and a better presentation of all the facts that the assessing officer needs while doing finally computing the taxable income of an assessee. Now coming to the regulatory part of the tax audit, as you all know that each partner of a firm has a limit of 60 assignments of tax audit that he can do in an assessment year. These do not include the head office, branch office. These are part of the same 60 limit. They're not added on separately. And the following audits are not covered in this ceiling. Audit under the presumptive tax of 44AD, 44ADA, 44AE, 44AF. These are not included in the 60 assignments, which means we can do 60 tax audits, plus we can do any certification required under these 4 sections also. This year, there has been some changes that have happened in the Income Tax Act and there's a lot of discussion going on the applicability of tax audit to various assessees. Earlier, it was very simple. You went on turnover. If you exceeded the turnover of professionals of 25 lakhs or 1 crore in case of business, tax audit was applicable. Now the government has amended 44AB to have certain other criteria where certain exemptions have been granted for the tax audits. I will go through them one by one because these are very important to determine whether tax audit is applicable to a particular assessee or not. The first one is a person carrying on business up to a turnover of 1 crore. And if he has no, his condition of cash payments is cash receipts and cash expenditures is less than 5% of the total turnover, then tax audit is not applicable. If the 5% limit is breached either for cash receipts or for cash payments, then even though his turnover may be less than 1 crore, he would still have to get a tax audit report done. Right. If the total turnover of the assessee is more than 10 crores, then he would have to get a tax audit report done in any case, irrespective of the cash limit. Person carrying on profession, the gross receipts exceeding 50 lakhs, he has to get a tax audit done. Now, in case of person carrying on business and opting for presumptive tax under section 44AB, a person other than an individual or a HUF or a firm, in case of an individual HUF or a firm other than an LLP, the limit is now 2 crores. This limit is only applicable where the condition of minimum profit he has declared is 6% of the turnover, of the total turnover, or 8% in case the receipts are mixed, that means cash and check. So to explain this a little bit further, in case the assessee chooses to pay tax under presumptive tax under 44AD and he declares an income of 6% of the turnover and his turnover is up to 2 crores, then and he has all his income in check, then he would not be required to get a tax audit done. However, if some part of that income is in cash, then on the cash part, he must declare an income of 8% rather than 6%. Then he would be exempted from tax audit report. In case a person carrying on profession, as referred to in section 44AA, opting for presumptive tax under section 44ADA, if the gross receipts are up to 50 lakhs and he declares 50% of the same as profits, then no tax audit required. If the gross receipts are up to 50 lakhs and he declares income less than 50%, then he would be required to get a tax audit done, even though his gross receipts do not breach the 50 lakhs limit. So this is a very important thing, that we must not look at only the turnover, but also the percentage of profit. And the third criteria is how much of the same is in cash or by check. There is, okay, next. Tax audit under 44AB, there is a form 3, as we all know, there's a form 3CB and there's a form 3CAA. 3CB is used mainly in case of non-corporate assessees, and 3CA is used mainly in case of corporate assessees or assessees where audit is conducted under some other section. Reporting under the tax audit, reporting format of the tax audit is, again, what I'm discussing here is what everybody knows, but I'm just trying to highlight the issue of true and correct and true and fair. So I'll go one by one. Reporting of 3CA and 3CD for corporate assessees, non-corporate assessee 3CB and 3CD. So 3CD is common in both the cases. The primary responsibility of preparation of the information is with the management of the company. The opinion of the auditor is true and fair in case of a balance sheet that which is audited under 3C. If you are attaching 3CA, then we are going to attach the balance sheet under some other law. Audited could be by the same auditor or could be by another auditor. In case the statutory audit is done by another auditor, we are, as per SA 600, we can use the work of another auditor to issue a true and fair view, because he must have issued a true and fair view report on the statutory audit. In terms of 3CB, para 3, it is on the balance sheet is being audited only for the tax audit purpose, and here also the balance sheet is true and fair. However, when we come to 3CD, it says everywhere that the information given in 3CD is always true and correct. That means we must have completeness and correctness. How do we ensure? The question arises, how do we ensure completeness and correctness of all information in large cases, small cases? Can we check each and every voucher and each and every piece of information to give this completeness and correctness and true and correct information? Here, the Institute has issued a guidance note under section 44AB. If we read the revised edition of 2014, they have given us in para 13.6 guidance wherein we can use SA 320 materiality concept in planning and performing of audits. I may read out this 13.6 paragraph of the guidance note, which says the requirement in para 3 of form 3CA and para 5 of 3CB relating to 3CD is the auditor should report the particulars in 3CD as true and correct. The terminology true and fair is widely understood, though not defined even in the Companies Act. On the other hand, the word true and correct lay emphasis on factual accuracy of information. In this context, reference is invited to AS1 and ASIT1 relating to disclosure of accounting policies. These standards recognize that the major considerations governing the selection and application of accounting policies are prudence, substance or form, and materiality. These are very important words that the Institute has given us for guidance. Therefore, while keep giving particulars in Form 3CD, these aspects should be kept in view. In particular, considering the nature of particulars to be given in Form 3CD, the aspect of materiality should be considered. So this paragraph I recommend to all my fellow members is a very important aspect of materiality, which will give us some guidance on how we are supposed to do our planning materiality and performing materiality, which we must take care of and document while we are doing the audit of tax audit of any entity. A small issue that appointment of there must be NOC procedure must be applied even for tax audit, just like when we can start a tax statutory audit, we take an NOC from the preceding auditor. The same person cannot, who is doing a tax audit, cannot be also conducting the internal audit. The name that we use in the tax audit report must be as per the PAN card of and name and address of the assessee. In case of change of name after the end of the previous year, but before the signing of the tax audit report, the new name should be considered. That means I must take the name of the company as on date of signing of the audit report. Previous year, for newly set up business, beginning from commencement of the new business instead of 1st April. So there will be some tax audit reports which will not be for 12 months, but could be for a shorter period. So here we must write clearly that it's the date of starting and commencement of business or incorporation of the company. The partnership firms here are also include LLPs. We are now, I'm now skipping to certain clauses of the tax audit report, which in my opinion are important or need some clarification, or where we feel that we have taken a view in our firm. to make sure that we give the right disclosures. So I'm coming now straight away to clause number 9 of the tax audit report. Which requires disclosure of the partnership firms. Here, though the word LLP is not written, since limited liability partnerships are also partnership firms, similar information that we are giving for profit sharing ratio, loss sharing ratio, etc., should be given for both partnerships and LLPs. In the profit sharing ratio and loss sharing ratio are both different. Both should be mentioned. In case there's a change in partner member profit sharing ratio many times during the previous year, each of these changes should be clearly stated. When a partner is a partner in representative capacity, retires and is admitted again as a partner in his individual capacity, this will tantamount to change in constitution of the firm. Remuneration paid or interest given are not required to be disclosed under this clause. Now we come to the most complicated and the most important part of today's discussion. And I have chosen this particular aspect because we have done a lot of research. There are a lot of gray areas which are still outstanding, in my view, in the ICDS disclosures that are given in clause 13 of the tax audit report. And there are various views, various articles that come in almost every journal and published on tax audit, on ICDS. So I will like to humbly give certain views that we have. May not be the perfect solution to every problem, but I hope that the suggestions we are giving may help the members understand the application of ICDS rules a little better while filling up the tax audit report. So, friends, clause 13 of the income computation and disclosure standards was introduced under as per section 145(2) of the Income Tax Act by notification number so and so on 29 September 2016. The revised ICDS standards for the computation to tax came in with effect from assessment year 17, 18, and subsequent years. The income computation and disclosure standards are applicable for computation of taxable income chargeable under the head profits and gains of business and profession, that is PGBP, or income from other sources, and not for the purpose of maintenance of books of accounts. So the assessee has to maintain the accounts based on IGAAP, Ind AS, whatever method of accounting or applicability that he has, or the accounting standard that are applicable. And ICDS does not prescribe how the books of accounts are to be maintained. In case, this is very important, that in case of a conflict between the provisions of the Income Tax Act and the ICDS standards, the provisions of the Act shall prevail to that extent. This is written in the ICDS rule itself. In the preamble, it says, in case of conflict between provisions of the Income Tax Act and this income computation and disclosure standards, the provision of the Act shall prevail. So this is very clearly given, not in the Income Tax Act, but in the ICDS notification annexure preamble itself. ICDS shall be applicable to all assessees other than individuals or HUF who are not required to get their accounts required to get his accounts for the previous year audited in accordance with provision section 44 AB of the Act. So individuals and HUF who are not required to get their accounts audited will not be covered by the ICDS rules. Others who are required because of the, remember we had discussed that some individuals and HUFs are required to get their account audited, will be covered by ICDS rules also. This is without any threshold limits. So a company who has got a turnover of 100 rupees is also covered by ICDS rules, even though a tax audit may not be applicable to that company, without any threshold limits of turnover or income and following the mercantile system of accounting. So this is again a very important aspect, that entities which are following cash system of accounting, the ICDS rules do not apply to them. The fifth and the most important part of this ICDS, which I think is actually the most important, is the ITRs have a separate line column, where this is the issue that I think all of us are facing, a separate line column for disclosure of separate nature of disallowance as mentioned above. And if these disallowances are reported in ICDS as well as tax audit, then there's a possibility of double addition of the same amount while processing the ITR under 143(1). As we know now, the tax department is going towards artificial intelligence, and once we file electronically, the computation of taxable income and the ITR, the computer software matches the two and comes up with disallowances which are given under the intimation that we get under 143(1), and therefore we have to be very careful that the same amount is not shown twice in both under the tax audit report specific reporting requirements as well as in ICDS. And we will, when we go through the next few slides, we'll find, I'll try to show some examples of what such cases are where there is a duplication of the two. Mapped with the ITR, with the tax audit report, we'll show these discrepancies of the amounts reported under clause 13E of the tax audit report as per ICDS if the same are not considered in specific column of ICDS under ITR. Now we come to the first specific example of the disclosures under ICDS. So clause 13 relating to ICDS, subclause E, gives the 10 ICDS standards. These are the 10 ICDS standards. And under each of these ICDS standards, we are supposed to give what are the adjustments that each of them require. The first is on accounting policy, the valuation and inventories, construction contracts, revenue recognition, tangible fixed assets, effects of changes in foreign currency, government grants, securities, borrowing cost, provision of contingencies, and contingent assets. Now, let's go to the next. The next clause, the clause F, talks about disclosure as per ICDS for 8 standards instead of 10. 2 standards are omitted in this disclosure. Here it talks about accounting policies up to provisions for contingencies, but changes in foreign exchange rates and securities are not included under this. So we have to be careful that these 2 accounting ICDS standards are not included. There are 10 in the first one and 8 in the second one. Some practical implications of while filling up these 2 forms and these 2 clauses that we have found. I'm just going to take you through some practical problems so that because these are, in ICDS is such a big topic that we can devote maybe a full day to discussing each one of them. But I'm just going to take you through some simple issues which we have faced and how we have tried to show you how we have solved them. Loss on sale of fixed assets in case of WDV, the capital item, will be added back to the profit loss account under clause 13E of the ICDS 5. The clause is tangible fixed assets. Now, any adjustment in tangible fixed assets is supposed to be given here. Also, when we do a calculation under 21A of the tax audit report 3CD, there also we have to give expenditure of capital nature debited to P&L account. Now, if we give this twice, again, the artificial intelligence of the computer will pick up this for double addition. So I am recommending, and I'm just telling you what we do in our firm. We give it under clause 21A and not under 13E. You can give a clarification now as a you can attach some standard notes along with 3CA and 3CB, and in that you can give a clarification that this is what you have done and not given duplication. And these standard notes are allowed to be attached along with the balance sheets that we attach. Standard notes can be attached with a tax audit report, which can give these clarifications. Because as you know, the form itself, there's no place for writing any further clarification inside that. Allowance for depreciation as per Income Tax Act and Companies Act. Here again, under clause 18, the depreciation as per IT Act is given in the tax audit report, where the full chart of the block of assets, rate of depreciation, actual cost, everything is fully charted out. So we don't give this again in clause 13E, and we write there again in standard notes that 13E information has been given under clause 18 itself, and therefore double information is not being given. Unrealized loss on reinstatement of ECB loans taken for purchase of fixed assets, which are imported fixed assets, is again required to be disclosed under section 13, clause 13E, under the head borrowing cost. Sorry, changes in foreign currency, because this is relating to mark-to-market adjustment in the year end. Now, as you know, this is also a capital expenditure under section 43A. So if we come to 43A section of the Income Tax Act, that says that if you have borrowed money in foreign exchange and you have used it to buy a capital asset, then the interest on that capital asset will only be allowable when you pay the loan, and the interest, the foreign exchange fluctuation amount will be allowable only in the year when you actually incur that expenditure or income. It could be either way, depending on the foreign currency, how the Indian rupee behaves, on the time you repay the loan. Till that time, when you do a mark-to-market adjustment on 31st March of every year, that is a capital expenditure debited to P&L account and can be shown under 21A, and again will not be again shown under clause 13E for foreign exchange fluctuation. Interest as borrowing cost under clause 21I. Under clause 21I, let me, friends, take you first to the first lines of section clause 21 of the tax audit report. Says, please furnish details of amount debited to profit loss account, being in nature of capital expenditure, personal advertisement expenditure, etc. These all amounts are to be disallowed. So whatever you put under this clause will be added back by the tax department. The last clause under this is I, which says amount inadmissible under proviso to section 36(1)(3). Now, what is this 36(1)(3)? Are deductions provided for in the following clauses shall be allowed in respect of matters dealt with herein, computing the income on the section referred to in section 28. 36(1)(3) is the amount of interest paid in respect of capital borrowed for the purpose of business or profession, provided that any amount of interest paid in respect of capital borrowed for acquisition of an asset, whether capitalized in the books or not, for any period beginning from the date on which the capital was borrowed for acquisition of the asset till the date on which the asset was first put to use shall not be allowed as a deduction. So here the new concept comes in of put to use. This is as different from being put to use and ready for use. So it could be possible that you may have capitalized an asset and capitalized interest up to the date when it was ready for use. But in Income Tax Act, as per Section 36, the interest will be allowable to you only after the asset has been put to use. There could be a gap between the two. So there's a small window between ready for use and put to use. This difference of interest is added back to the computation of taxable income under this particular clause. And this is again a duplication between ICDS and clause 21I of the tax audit report. Here again, humbly, my view is that I will put it under 21I and not under 13E to avoid duplication of addition. Practical implication of ICDS 2. Moreover, ICDS 9 also required to compute borrowing cost for inventories which requires a period of more than 12 months or more to bring them to a saleable condition. However, Section 36(1)(3) is not applicable in inventories. Therefore, interest as borrowing cost under Section 13A shall be to the extent on borrowing cost computed for the said inventories. Here again, the issue is that if you have borrowed money on working capital and your inventory requires more than 1 year for preparation, the interest element to that extent will be added to the cost of inventories and will not be allowed as a deduction for those particular inventories, and has to be added back under clause. This is added back under clause 13A. Provision created for uncertain liability under clause 13E of ICDS and under clause 21G as a liability of contingent nature. So if I read 21G, particulars of liability of a contingent nature. So if you have any liability that you have made a provision for, which is of contingent nature, it will be disallowed under 21G, and a similar requirement is also under clause 13E. So here again, there's a conflict of a double disclosure, and I would recommend that we use 21G and not 13E for this disclosure. So friends, that was some very high level issues relating to ICDS, though I am sure I have not answered, may not have answered a lot of queries, and will create even more controversies and queries on ICDS. But it is a very interesting topic. It's a very debated topic, and I have given some suggestions, but not completely comprehensive. And maybe the guidances that I've given will help the members to fill up the tax audit report correctly and not have any practical double disallowances under 143(1) assessments. Now we come to clause 16 of the tax audit report, which talks about any amounts which are not credited to the P&L account. Though now our guidance notes of the institute and our accounting standards are very clear that all incomes and expenditures have to be routed through the profit and loss account only and cannot be routed through any other, you can't take them directly through any reserves. However, it still happens that if there is any amount that has been taken directly to any reserve or credited to any other equity account in case of a corporate assessee or a non-corporate assessee, then, and it is in nature of revenue item, then we must disclose it here so that it is added or subtracted from for determining the taxable income of the assessee. Friends, clause 17 on transfer of land and building, I think is the most, again, debated topic everywhere in India. is when we sell a land and building which is below and is registered below the circle rate, the differential between the stamp duty value and the actual consideration is now added to the income. So here I've only differentiated that the asset could be held as an inventory or it could be held as a PPE, as a fixed assets. So if it is held as inventory, then the difference would be taxed under the profits and gains of business and profession. In case the asset being in question is held as a fixed asset or PPE, it will be taxed under the head capital gain. Clause 18 is again depreciation, particular depreciation allowable. This clause required reporting of depreciation on assets to be claimed during the previous year, along with details of additions and deletions made during the year. The major issue in the mentioned clause is relating to computation of depreciation, where there is a case of amalgamation and merger. In such cases, as per 6th proviso to section 32(1) of the Income Tax Act, if there is an amalgamation, merger, demerger of a company, then the depreciation on the transferred asset for the year is to be allowed proportionately between the two companies. I have tried to explain this by way of an example. Let us suppose a company is under a scheme of demerger having an opening value of asset of rupees 1,000, and the scheme was approved with effect from 1st December, and the new resulting company B has come into existence, was effect from 1st December itself, and B receives the total value of assets under demerger of rupees 400 from A. Now, B will get depreciation on rupees 400 for the period 1st December to 31st March. A will get depreciation on rupees 1,000 from 1st April to 30th November. Now, it is not these calculation, the rate of depreciation is 15% is same for both, but in the ITR, neither the tax audit report, now the utility of the tax audit report by the tax department has any facility for mentioning and calculating these numbers. So what we do is that we put there's an adjustment column there for depreciation where we can put the differential. We have to manually calculate the depreciation for both the companies and put the figure in the adjustment column. You can attach these details in the standard notes at the back of the tax audit report so that it is explained. But this is a lacuna in the tax audit report where the act says that we must recalculate, but the ITR form or even the tax audit report does not have a column for the same. So you may face this problem, and this is how we are solving this issue to give the correct depreciation to both the demerged entity and the original entity. Coming to the next clause, 20B. This is a very recent amendment to employees' contribution to PF, ESI and other funds. This is relating to the employer contribution to the funds. Till now, there was a judgment, let's go to the next slide, of EMIL, which we were applying of Delhi High Court, which said that even if in case of employee contribution to these funds, if the amount was paid before the due date of filing of return, under 43B, it was covered, and we were claiming the deduction for the same. However, now explanation 2 has been added to the proviso to section 43B recently, and I may read out this particular clause. which says, for removal of doubts, it is hereby clarified that the provision of this section shall not apply and shall be deemed to never to have been applied to a sum received by the cessee from his employees, to which the provision of subsection 10 of clause 24 of section 2 applies. In simple language, it means that that based on this explanation, you are only allowed to claim deduction of the employee contribution which you deduct from his salary up, and as long as you paid before the due date under the relevant act and not up to due date of filing of return. The controversy now that arises is whether this explanation amendment is retrospective in application or applies only for the current year, assessment year 21-22, for which we are going to file the tax audit reports now. I am giving certain recent judgments. In fact, there's one ITAT judgment of Indian Geotechnical Services, which has recently come, which has said that this is clarificatory in nature and will have a prospective application and not retrospective application. So in the past cases, if we have applied ML judgment, that would still stand. But we don't know how these things will stand out and pan out really. So, but for March 21, assessment year 21-22, the tax audit reports that are going to be filed now, you have to apply this provision and ensure that if there's an employee contribution to these funds, and if it is beyond the due date under the Act, it will have to be disallowed under section 36(1)(5)(a). Clause 21(a), expenses debited in the profit loss account in the nature of capital, personal, advertisement, etc. This clause required to be reporting expenses debited to P&L account in nature of all these expenses, which we have just discussed earlier also. One issue faced in this is any expenditure not being expenditure of the nature described in section 30 to 36, not being of capital nature or personal expenses of the cessee, laid out wholly on and exclusively for the purpose of business and profession, shall be allowed in computing the income chargeable under the head profits and gains of business and profession. Further, section 37(2)(b) of the Act specifically disallows expenditure incurred by an assessee on advertisement in any souvenir, brochure, tract, pamphlet, or other of the political party. So political party expenditures have to be still disallowed now. One of the issues that comes up from most litigation is club expenses, because this particular clause of the tax audit report under 21(a) asks for expenditures incurred at club being cost of club services and facilities used. Now, these expenditures, once they are reported here, we have found a lot of cases are automatically disallowed by the department without considering whether a part of them are also for the purpose of wholly and exclusively incurred for the purpose of business, where there is a corporate membership and the assessee is using these memberships to entertain the company's guests, could be customers, could be suppliers, could be for meetings, which are allowable expenditure as per these some judgments that I have cited here of Bombay High Court, Madras High Court, and Delhi High Court. Thus, there could be an option in that there should have been. This is my suggestion that there should be an option in the tax audit report to mark it as corporate or individual memberships, because there is no distinction here between club membership as corporate or individual. Similarly, the cost of usage of club facilities for holding business meetings with customers, associates in the above cases should be allowed, and there should again be a distinction on whether these are the expenditures are liable or not. In our view, the automatic disallowances being done in ITR processing under any amount reported under this clause is really not justified, but I'm sure someday the government will wake up to this and give a clarification. Friends, clause 23, 48(2)(b), I just wanted to point it out that the clause 48(2)(b) related party transaction is a very old clause, been in the Income Tax Act since day one, since 1961. And now after AS 18 and Ind AS 24 coming into operation, there are very lengthy disclosures that we do in each of our statutory signed accounts. However, so we need to be careful that while we fill up this 48(2)(b) annexure, these are only in relation to expenditures which are debited to P&L account and not relating to assets and liabilities or loans, etc. Secondly, the definition of 48(2)(b) is a little bit wider than definition of related party under AS 18 and AS 24. For example, grandparents and grandchildren are covered under 48(2)(b), though they may not be covered under AS 18 and AS 24. Clause 25, amount chargeable to tax under section 41. This is a clause, residuary clause, basically which talks about add backs that take place in the income of the assessee. Any recovery of a loss or expenditure of a trading liability under section 41(1) is added back, so, which means that if you have claimed an expenditure of a trading liability and later on you are not paying it for any reason and you add it back, then it must be reported here as an income. Sale proceeds from capital asset used in scientific research, where you have claimed 100% deduction for the same and you are selling the asset, that whole amount of sale proceeds becomes taxable. The amount recovered from a bad debt which was written off in the earlier year is again fully taxable. Amount withdrawn from any special reserve that you created from the post-tax profits, if it is taken back into the income, becomes taxable again. Some critical issues that come up for again application of section 41, clause 25. The amount disclosed under this clause are only for reporting purpose and does not require to be added back again in the taxable income. Previous records have to be verified before taxability of any recovered amount is determined, because we must know whether when we pass the original entry, did we treat that as a taxable event or a non-taxable event. Only then we can determine whether in the current year, when the amount is written back or written off, becomes a taxable event or not under section 41. Special consideration of judicial pronouncements, mainly in case of one-time settlement with the bank, with tantamount to reduction in capital. So here again, there are various controversies on one-time settlement with the bank. For example, whether a term loan which is used for capital expenditure only, when it is written and eventually the bank gives you a write-off, whether that becomes a capital receipt in the hands and non-taxable or is taxable. So these are issues that need special consideration while planning the disclosure under section 41. Clause 26, allowances and disallowances under 43(b). I think this is the most used and most talked about section, and the most where we spend a lot of time on each tax audit. Some practical issues that we have faced is TDS is not covered under 43(b) as it is not debited to P&L account, even though GST is again not debited to the P&L account but is covered under 43(b) because of the provision of section 145A. Only funded gratuity is covered under this clause, which means that if you have a LIC policy and you have funded your gratuity, and there you can claim a deduction for the funded gratuity up to the date, and you paid the premium up to the due date of filing of return, you will get a deduction. While in case of unfunded gratuity, clause 21E 48(7) is applicable, and you will only get a deduction if you have paid it up to the year end of 31st March, not beyond that. Excess contribution to gratuity fund similarly can be claimed, like I said in the first clause, that if you have paid it to a funded gratuity and you have paid excess contribution, that also will be allowed up to the due date of filing a return. Custom duty or any other taxes paid in advance can also be claimed, because this is again covered under 43(b), will be allowed only in the year of payment. Interest payable to NBFCs not captured at all at the moment in Form 3CD yet. So these are not covered. The bank interest is covered, but NBFC interest is not covered under 3CD. Leave travel allowance is again not covered and not required to be disclosed under 43B. Clause 26A, payments under section 43B, which are pre-existing on the first day of the previous year. This clause requires the reporting of payments made in respect of natures mentioned in 43B, which pre-existed on the first day of the previous year, but were not allowed in the preceding year, but were paid during the year. The issue that you face in this clause is that if the opening balance in the nature of referred under 43B was written back during the year, but was not paid, there is no provision in the tax audit report to give a proper disclosure. So what do? There was 100 rupees outstanding liability being shown, which was added back in the preceding years. This year I did not pay it, but I wrote it back because that was probably by mistake an excess provision made. So what if it is added to my P&L account as income, but I must reduce it because I have not, it's not a taxable income. So what do? I normally put it as a payment and in 43B, and so that my taxable income gets reduced, though it's the wrong disclosure, because actually I've not paid it, I've written it back. So what we do is that then we give a proper disclosure to this in the standard notes at the back.
Yes.
Next. The clause 31C, 269T. This again is a clause where any payment which is done for repayment of a loan, otherwise than by electronic system or a account pay check, needs to be disclosed. Here again, there is no provision to disclose a conversion of a loan into equity. So a repayment of a loan can be done also by a conversion to another security or an instrument, for which there is no provision made in the tax audit report for this purpose. So though we have to show opening balance, then we have to show that it was repaid, and we cannot show that it's only a tick in the box whether the repayment has been done by account pay check or not, though it is not account. So we normally do not give this information in this clause. We again give it by way of standard notes at the back, because and I'm sure the government, since this is not a taxable event, no penalty under 269T is leviable. There are some judgments on these provisions of Bombay High Court and others, and it's very clear that 271E penalty is not leviable in a case where repayment of loan takes place by way of conversion into any instrument. But there is no provision yet in the tax audit report or the ITR to clearly disclose this information. Friends, now I will, after going through all the major clauses, there are certain mismatches that are still there that we have found between the utility as per the Income Tax Act of the tax audit report itself and the IT tax audit form 3CD as it appears in our rule book. What is the first one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the prescribed form, there is no reporting requirement for shares of the AOP members, while in the utility which is there of the tax audit report, the shares of the AOP members need to be mentioned. In clause 12, in the prescribed form, there is a reporting requirement of presumptive profits which are included in the profit loss account, which includes the following: 44 AD, AE, AF, B, BB, BBA, BBB only. While in the utility, the reporting requirement of one more section is there, which is 44 ADA, which is relating to presumptive tax provision for professionals. This is missing in form 3CD. In clause 16B and 26BB, in the prescribed form, the impact of GST and its related ITC is not considered in various clauses mentioned in the first column, while in the utility, this has been incorporated. So there's a mismatch between the utility and the Form 3CD. Clause 19, in the prescribed form, there's a reporting requirement of deductions allowable under various sections 32, 33, and 35. Out of those, one section is not incorporated in the form, which is 35ABA, which relates to expenditure for obtaining right to use spectrum or telecommunication services. In the utility, they ask us to report the reduction of 35ABA, but in the prescribed form, this section was missing, not available for reporting. Under clause 21B3, in the prescribed form, there is no clause for reporting non-payment of equalization levy. This, my friend, is very important clause, since the equalization levy has been levied, is a disallowable expenditure under 40AIB, and there is no clause for in the 3CD prescribed form for giving this disclosure, but the utility now has incorporated the equalization levy. So where if we do not deduct equalization levy on payments made under section 165 to foreign entities, this is liable to be disallowed, and the disclosure needs to be done under the utility. So we need to incorporate that into our tax audit report manually. Clause 31, BC and BD, in the prescribed form, specified clauses require reporting of any payments made under section 271 ST. The word payment has been used, while in the utility the word receipt has been used, which is incorrect, because the receipt part has already been covered under 35B and DB in the form as well as in utility. So this seems to be a misprint. We need to this needs to be corrected by the government. 35B. In the prescribed form, there is a reporting requirement of quantitative details in respect to raw materials, finished goods, and byproducts, but no specific bifurcation is available for byproducts. However, the utility bifurcates all three details separately, that is, quantity details of raw materials, finished goods, and byproducts. So we have to be very careful while preparing the tax audit report, that we must also incorporate the quantity tally of the byproducts also, and so that the ITR utility is filled up properly. But with that, I come to an end to my presentation. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me. If I have any queries, I'll be happy to answer to the extent I can. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
संदीप सर, एक क्वेश्चन है. संदीप जी, sir, when the tax audit report of current year may be submit?
Sorry?
Sir, current year की tax audit report कब तक submit हो पाएंगी?
Current year की tax audit report का तो extend हो गया अब time. I think they have given us time up to 31st January. 15 January. 15 January to submit it.
Sir, second question है, the tax audit not as remunerative as we see in 2005 to 15 because of paradigm shift in technology and government interference and curtailing the power of a practicing chartered accountant.
Sir, we have to go with the times. That we are going towards artificial intelligence. This is the mapping of what we file in the tax audit report and the ITR and the balance sheet, the three financial documents that come to the government. Now, the government cannot manually tally all of them. We may have a different, suppose we have a different figure, for example, of depreciation in the balance sheet and different tax audit and different in the ITR. How will they tally it? So this artificial intelligence that the government is using is actually very good. And if we are very careful in filing the documents, then the assessments that we do, 99% will be done automatically, and we get clean assessment orders, which has happened in a lot of cases. But yes, there are, as I pointed out, there are some glitches yet, and it's a work in progress with both with the government, and I think the Institute of Chartered Accountants is also helping the government a lot in this. And in a few years, I think we will get over all of them. As we keep facing these problems, they'll get solved.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for giving me your wonderful revelation on today's webinar. Thank you very much on behalf of Karnal
Thank
branch.
you.
Also.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Now I request CS Amit Gupta ji, sir, to kindly start today's webinar session, second session.
Thank you, Deepak ji.
Please.
Yeah, thank you everyone for giving me an opportunity and committee member in practice in the Karnal branch to talk about the InvIT and REIT regulations and the accounting considerations thereof. So let me just share my slides. So Deepak ji, is my slide visible to you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Fine, sir.
Okay.
बिल्कुल clear है, sir.
Okay, so thank you everyone. So what we're going to talk about is accounting and auditing considerations for InvIT and REIT. And I must thank our fellow speaker, Sandeep ji, for giving an insightful session on the tax audit. So I think before I go ahead with the InvIT and REIT, I think the topic when we were discussing with the committee member and the Karnal branch, the idea was why tax audit and InvIT and REIT together. And we really thought that two topics which are very relevant to the members in practice today. One is around tax audit, which is just continues to have a lot of changes and a lot of deliberations happening, and also a new set of development around InvIT and REITs, which is today as we see more and more prominence. If you see everyday's newspapers, one or the other InvIT is getting listed, a REIT is coming into play. There's a lot of new kind of euphoria in the market around this thing. So the idea was, let's talk about this topic. And of course, there are very few InvITs and REITs in India, but be rest assured that there will be few very significant amount of activity we expect on this front. So while we just put together a small slide in terms of what really are the kind of InvITs and REITs in India, and if you see that there are only 14 of those as of now. There are a few public, 3 public InvITs and 3 public REITs, and other are private REITs. So that's again, for InvIT we can have a private one, while for REITs you need to have a public one. So Embassy was the first public REIT in India. Today, if you look at the 3 listed REITs, they have a market cap of more than $10 billion. And surprisingly, if you see globally, there in US, the REIT phenomena is there since 1960s. If you look at globally, I would say there are almost 800 REITs. In India, there are only 3 today. If you look at US itself has over 200 REITs. So what exactly has happened in India and why this is becoming an important topic for discussion today? That was the whole idea, because all the infrastructure development which has happened in developed countries, there's a lot of capital required. And REITs and InvITs are an important vehicle to raise the global capital. And to, if you look at the, government plans by 2025, they are looking at, and government recently announced that they're looking at a USD $1.5 trillion of investment in infra space, which could be roads, ports, highways, power transmission, and all of that. Where does the capital come from? And I think this I personally believe, and we strongly believe as a firm, that InvITs and REITs are the vehicle which will help India generate and kind of pull on the global capital, capital from sovereign funds, long-term pension funds. So that kind of a capital is what the India infrastructure and real estate sector requires. And InvIT and REITs gives a very distinct advantage, which we're going to talk about in subsequent slides. So if you see the list of investors here, they are pretty much the who's who, the whole market list of investors which have already invested in InvITs or REIT in India. So there is already a lot of promise. And if you see, 2017 was the first InvIT which came through, and in 2019 was the first REIT. But if you see, there are a lot of people would be seeing the newspapers, a lot of public sector companies like NHI is after now coming, Power Grid has recently come out with an InvIT. So, even the public sector is looking for a lot of InvITs and REITs. And of course, the private sector is also looking at a lot of REITs as well as InvITs. So moving on, what kind of sectors are there and assets which qualify for an InvIT or REIT? Commercial real estate, of course, residential real estate is not covered here. So that is one thing which members should be mindful of. Of course, roads and highways, as I talked about. Energy, it could be transmission assets, it could be renewable power assets. Recently, there's a renewable power asset, the first in India, which got listed. It's a private InvIT. It could be ports, it could be telecom towers. There are 2 or 3 of them already on the telecom towers, the giga fiber lines as well. And of course, the social and commercial infrastructure. Anything which has a fixed annuity income is a vehicle where you can take it through a REIT or an InvIT. And we'll talk more in further details about what really the kind of contours of this REIT and InvIT are. And what is a role chartered accountants can play there, what kind of issues which we look at as a part of our audits. I'm an auditor by profession, and we have seen a lot of issues coming out within the audits of InvITs and REITs, and we'll talk about that. So moving on, so let's briefly spend a little bit of time understanding the structure. It's very important to understand a brief contour for members who are just getting to this concept for the first time and not done this before. It's good to spend a little bit of time taking a reflection of what the InvIT or a REIT structure looks like. So of course, this is a business trust, infrastructure investment trust, as we call it, or a real estate investment trust. That's the full form of them. They're very similar to and akin to a mutual fund, but I think the difference here is you can make a direct investment into a eligible project. So you can just make, rather than in a company, which a mutual fund does, you will make, investors can make investment into a project to earn a portion of income as return. And of course, this will always have a 2 or 3 tiered structure. So there will be a sponsor, there will be an investment at the trust, which could be a real estate trust or infrastructure investment trust. And then it will have generally an SPV or multiple SPVs, which are holding assets. There could be also a holding company in between. So there will be a unit holder and a sponsor, and also there will be an investment manager. The guy who will manage this, it could be a legal entity, it could be a person who will manage the trust. There will be a trustee who will be the custodians. So there is a custodian here, there is a trust here, there is of course an investment manager who manages the trust, there are unit holders who will put the capital, and of course the InvIT or the trust will hold the assets. In case of an InvIT, there is also an additional intermediary called project manager, which does the O&M for the SPVs, which is not in the case of a REIT. So REIT and InvIT would have very subtle differences. We'll talk about them as we go along, but generally, broadly, for the purpose of the presentation, we kind of combine them in one go for the benefit of the members. Okay, so moving on, I think one most important and striking feature of an InvIT or a REIT is that, of course, as I talked about, this will be registered with SEBI, but 90% of the total net distributable cash flows, which will be called as NDCF, is 90% of that has to be distributed to the unit holder. So whatever cash is being generated here, 90% of that, on the simplistic terms, has to be distributed to the unit holders. Whatever is earned by the SPVs here, they have to distribute 90% of the cash to the InvIT of the trust. So that is how the mechanism happens. So there is a very promising amount of return which comes in. Whatever is generated gets distributed from SPVs to the trust, and from the trust into the unit holders. And that is a mandatory conditions for any InvIT or REIT to work under the SEBI regulations. So SEBI came out with the regulations in 2014. As I said, US was 1960, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia have been there for several years. Japan having over 60, 70 REITs, US over 200 REITs. They are there for almost 20, 30, 50 years. But India came out with its own set of challenges. But of course, SEBI was very keen to have the REITs and InvIT structures. And of course, they came out with the guideline in 2014. And of course, there have been multiple clarifications, and government has been very proactive in issuing the clarification just to make sure that these vehicles really survive the test of time. Okay, moving on. What are the key regulatory requirements? So there has to be first a certificate of registration. Whether you register yourself as an InvIT or a real estate investment trust, there has to be a mandatory registration by SEBI. So SEBI kind of has a little bit of an oversight. I would say not really, little bit, quite a bit of oversight on these vehicles. As I talked about, there could be persons who have to be designated as a trustee, investment manager, or sponsor, but they need to be all separate persons. One person can't do both the roles. So let's say a trustee can't be investment manager also. Of course, the cumulative project sizes where they should invest is minimum of 500 crores, and the issue size is more than 250 crores. The next one is that when they do an investment in an SPV, they should at least hold more than 50% at the SPV. So what does it mean is that, the InvIT or REIT would have the majority holding of the SPV. That gives a kind of a security cover to the investors because they are holding the majority stake into the asset. In resident, non-resident, both can invest there. And of course, related party transactions, SEBI has come out with detailed guidance in terms of how the related party transactions are looked at, in what situations a related party cannot vote, detailed disclosures around that. So there's a lot of oversight and focus on the related party transaction, that in this vehicle there is no hanky-panky which is played around. Why this is very important is otherwise is a very important piece around the tax advantages. So we'll talk about what the tax advantages of the structure are, but this is very important, and why this structure we believe is very promising and is there something which we'll see more and more abundance of that structure coming into India, with more and more companies going for this InvIT or the REIT route. The other one is that there is a very reduced risk of investors because more than 80% has to be invested in completed revenue generating assets. So when you are going to make an investment in SPV, a condition is that total REIT assets more than 80% should be in revenue generating. Only 20% you can put in under construction, you can put it in mutual funds, money market instruments, or cash and cash equivalents, government securities, but 80% has to be revenue generating mandatorily. And of course, as I said earlier, that when the investment happens, that this investment trust should hold at least 50% of the stake of the SPV. So that's very important. And of course, as I said, that the cash, 90% of the cash has to be mandatorily distributed. So there is a lot of advantages. So we'll talk about tax advantages. We have talked about the advantage around the investment of 90% of the distribution of cash. Whatever is generated is distributed. More than 80% in the revenue generating assets. They will hold more than 50% of the SPV. And of course, these are registered with SEBI. So there is a SEBI oversight on that. So that's again is very important to give the assurance to the investors. Of course, the last piece is around whether they can be both listed and unlisted. And when I say listed and unlisted, while they are registered with SEBI, they can be unlisted InvIT, but of course, no unlisted REIT. So REIT will be always listed; those will be always public. But a InvIT could be unlisted private also. So InvIT could be a listed public REIT, it could be a listed private, it could be unlisted private. So that's possible. And of course, the new amendment which government came out is that now they can borrow over 70% of their total assets. So InvIT can borrow around 70% of this. So there's a very high leverage which is allowed. They can borrow 70% of that. There was an issue with the minimum subscription size. So government came out with a notification somewhere in August of 2011, in 2021, where they actually have said that now you can just take even one unit as an investor. You need not have minimum 100 units. Previous cap was 1 lakh to 50,000 rupees, depending on InvIT and REIT. Now they say the minimum amount is 10 to 15,000. So we expect a lot of retail players coming into this because there was a very large size that at least a 1 lakh rupees investment for InvIT and 50,000 for a REIT was there. Now that lot size is reduced to 10 to 15,000 rupees. So this is how the regulations look like in terms of and of course we will look at some of the regulations. So there's an InvIT regulation of 2014, and there are numerous amount of circulars which SEBI has come out with. There is ICDR regulations, Indian Trust Act. As I said, these are trusts. So really a Companies Act does not apply to an InvIT and this thing, because this is really trust, and the Indian Trust Act will apply. Income Tax Act 1961 is very important in this case, because as I said, there are unique set of tax exemptions. So we'll talk about some of those now. I think in the hands of the InvIT, so if they get any interest or dividend from their SPV, that is fully exempt from tax. So in the new regime also, this is all fully exempt. So in the hands of InvIT or a REIT, whatever interest they get from SPV or any dividend they get from SPV, as I said, they have to mandatorily distribute 90%. SPV will have to give 90% of their income as dividend, but that is all exempt in the hands of the trust. In the hands of the SPV, whatever interest they are paying, or the dividend they are kind of paying to the trust, there is no withholding. So that's again a very big advantage. But another thing is that whatever interest they are paying is tax deductible. So while there is an interest income in the hands of the trust, which is not taxable, the interest outflow by the SPV is tax deductible. So there is kind of a dual advantage, because a place you're getting a tax deduction, while the other case, in the case of income, you're not paying any tax. And these are the part of theoretically the same group. And in terms of the unit holders, I think they are, if you are really, there's also no dividend, because as I said, the InvIT will also have to distribute 90% of their cash to the unit holders. When they do that, there is no dividend distribution tax. There's no tax which will be paid, provided the SPVs have not gone for the new concessional tax regime. If the SPVs have taken a new regime, then in that case, it will not be exempt in the hand of unit holder, but otherwise it is exempt. And of course, there is a nil capital gain in case, the investments are held by a sovereign wealth fund or a pension fund. So that's why if you see a lot of sovereign wealth fund and pension funds want to invest through the InvIT and REIT route, because there is no long-term capital gain tax. If you know that recently there was a change where a long-term capital gain tax was made applicable at the rate of 10%, which is not the case for sovereign wealth funds. So this is a brief precursor of in terms of how the regulations look like, and we'll now move on to the accounting and auditing considerations and conscious of the times. So I think the unique part about when somebody wants to go, when one of your clients want to go for a infrastructure investment trust, listing of that, or a real estate investment trust, what kind of requirements come and what kind of challenges come. That's the whole topic of the discussion today. And the first requirement from SEBI is that there has to be a combined financial statements of for last 3 completed years and an interim period. Interim period is very similar to an IPO, that they should not be more than 6 months old from the date of the offer or the offer document. So let's say the company is coming out with an issue in somewhere in June, so then they can take the last 3 years of March 21, March 20, and March 19. That's the 3 years. If you are coming somewhere in December, then possibly you'll have to give a 3 years plus an interim period, which should not be more than 6 months old. So you can take a September or an October. So that's the 3 years plus 1 stub period requirement. Auditors will have to give an audit report on the combined financial information. They also are required to give, this is the very unique part of the InvIT regulations, that you have to opine on the statement of net assets at fair value and statement of total return at fair value. So to my knowledge, this is pretty much the very unique regulations where there is a reporting by auditors on fair value. So not only the historical cost, but also the fair value will have to be reported upon. Now that's always is very challenging. What is the fair value of a particular asset? What is the fair value of a road? What is the fair value of a transmission line? So that's something is auditors are very comfortable with historical costs. So that's something is very important to look at. In terms of the last 3 years, there is a requirement of a combined financial information. Now, if you look at, there could be multiple SPVs. Now, those could be acquired, but there could be challenge around the availability of financial information. So what may happen is that there are 10 SPVs which are getting added into a InvIT, but not information is available for all of them in terms of the audit details, work papers for last 3 years. There could be also a challenge that these SPVs were audited by different auditor. Now, let's say there is an auditor A who is the auditor for an InvIT or a REIT. He has to sign off the financials for last 3 years, which were done by different auditors. Now that itself, the institute requires us to look at the opening balances, requiring that there is a standard on auditing there. You have to look at some basic work. That's very challenging. How do you manage that information which is audited by different auditors? there could be also a factor of the combined versus consolidated. So we'll talk about more about what is combined financial, what is consolidated. There could be also a challenge around the gap conversion. So, what could have happened is some SPVs have, an erstwhile Indian gap, while some other SPVs could be preparing under Ind AS. Now, the REIT regulation or InvIT regulation require all the combined financial statement to be prepared under Ind AS. And what that means is this whole gap conversion exercise becomes very important, and that's very challenging. Of course, there also has to be uniform accounting policies. Now, that's something has to be looked at. How do you make the policies uniform? There is a guidance note on combined and carve-out financials that has to be applied. There is also SA 600 around using the work of other auditor, guidance note and report on companies profit. So there's a lot of unique requirements which will come in. Institute has already come out with detailed guidance on this, but as we go along, our experience suggests there are always typical issues in applying these guidance notes in specific case facts. So just to summarize here, there is a requirement to have combined financial statements, and also it says that if the consolidated financial statements of the trust and assets are not available, then you do combined. And what combined financial statement would mean, this is very typical because what income and assets should be included. This is not really a legal entity. When you do a combined, you'll just add 10 companies together line by line. Now, this is not really a legal entity structure. The idea in a combined financial is to look at how these 10 entities, if they were added for last 3 years, how they want to look together. Now, there could be challenges around presentation of equity. How do you present equity? Because there's not really a share capital for this combined entity. Every 10 of the entities will have share capital, but on a consolidated basis, there's no significance for that. So when you do a consolidated financial information, that is more easier. You just have to do intercompany eliminations. You look at recent accounting updates. But when we do in combined, this is more challenging. So I think the requirement of the circular is to give a combined financials as of now, in case the consolidated for last 3 years is not available. So that's there. Of course, the other thing is that, as I said, that the Companies Act does not apply. So when the Companies Act does not apply, the Schedule 3, which gives all the disclosure requirement for a company, does not apply. So SEBI came out with a circular in 2016 for InvITs and December 2016 for REIT. So that was an October circular for InvIT and December circular for REIT, very similar to each other, where they actually are saying that you should follow a format similar to the Schedule 3. So that's important that, while there is no prescriptive guidelines around the guidance note by ICAI, based on the SEBI circular, the whole of the disclosures and the accounting happens. Okay, moving on. The next requirement for an InvIT or a REIT is that there has to be a disclosure and an audit report on auditors reporting on net distributable cash flows. As I said, that in a REIT or InvIT structure, the SPVs will give 90% of their cash to mandatory distribute that to a InvIT, and InvIT will do a 90% cash distribution to the unit holder. Now, what will be this net distributable cash flow? This is very, very judgmental. Because it actually says the investment manager will consider how much the debt they expect to repay, how much they want to reinvest, and whatever is the amount, they will calculate put the detailed formula. And if you see various documents, there are only 14 of them as of now. But if you look at the documents, there are a lot of different procedures and accounting which has been done by different companies or different trusts, because this is very judgmental. So this requires a lot of estimates, but again, this is required to be certified or audited by a auditor. So that's something is very important. This is again, how much you distribute really this thing. The requirement is also that in case of a private InvIT or a REIT, you have to do this net distributable cash flow once in a year, while for a public one, you have to do every 6 months the distribution. So this again is a very typical accounting and auditing challenge, both for the company to account for it, as well as for the auditors to audit it. So next one is around the statement of projections. So while I talked about the fair valuation at the overall level, there is also the requirement and the regulations that the statutory auditor of the trust will certify the statement of projections of revenue and operating cash flows along with the assumptions for next 3 years. So let's say if you are doing hypothetically a toll project, a company which is having multiple toll projects is SPV, the company will estimate how much traffic will pass on this toll for next 3 years. They will make those assumptions and give them to auditors to certify. Now that's very challenging. If you have a business which is more annuity, let's say a renewable power, where again the rate per unit is fixed and you have some generation data, some scientific basis to kind of determine it, that's easier. But in case you have something like a road assets, it is very difficult because you will really have to estimate the traffic, and traffic could be based on traffic studies, but that's again is very challenging. So in this case, the auditors of the InvIT or the REIT is also supposed to certify these projections. So for next 3 years, and it says for next 3 completed years. So some people will take it the 3 completed years. Some people will consider this sub year as well. So that also is a little bit. So the institute has come out with an SAE, the examination of prospective financial information. But as we have gone along, we have done that in practice. It's very difficult to certify the going forward because the investment decision is also being made by investors looking at the projections. So it is very important for the company or the management of the investment manager or the board of the investment manager, as well as the auditors and the valuers, to look at it wholeheartedly, look at all the assumptions, challenge themselves, and then make sure that these are adequately disclosed in the offer document. Okay, moving on. So we talked about the combined financials, we talked about the statement of projections, and we also talked about the net distributable cash flows. So those are the different kind of accounting and auditing considerations we talked till now. Next could be carve out. So if you look at 2 or 3 public documents, there was a pipeline business, there was a fiber business of Reliance, where there was carve out financials. This is a separate set of financials as compared to a consolidated financials wherein a carve out happens. So there is a company which has 3 businesses. Or let's say I'll take a real estate example. In case of a REIT, there could be a company which has a constructed building and they have an under constructed building. They want to just take, the InvIT want to take, or the REIT wants to take only the constructed building and not the under constructed. So there has to be a carve out financial statements prepared for it. Then again, the questions come in terms of how do you allocate the common expenses? How do you kind of carve this out? How do you show the demerger accounting? So that's again very complicated. But that's something we should be aware of. There is also, as I said, out of the 14 documents, there are 2 of them where there were carve out financials and a specific project was invested into. So we will have some background and some kind of a precedent there. Next is around the project-wise fair valuation. So this is where a valuer come in, an independent valuer has to be appointed in the InvIT and REIT, who will look at the project-wise fair valuation and the combined fair valuation of net assets. Now that's again is very, very typical because all the detailed assumptions have to be given. You have to look at the, the valuer is free to take different assumptions for different projects. Let's say there is one project versus another, they can decide to have different projections or different assumptions. Now then it's looking that the auditor will also have to report on the fair valuation. So they will also look at it separately. So this is very time consuming and detailed exercise, both for the company as well as the valuer, as well as the auditor. So there's an interplay of multiple parties there. Next one is statement of possible tax benefits. And that's where, the auditor has to certify that what will be the tax benefits that will be available to the trust and the unit holders, once this is listed. So as of date, and this has to be followed with an auditor certificate on that one. So if you look at, recently for trust, there is a dividend distribution tax that was abolished. There was a concession rate of tax and new tax regime which came in. MAT implications have come in. You are buying and selling. There could be 56 implications when the trust buys the asset of an SPV or the shares of an SPV. Now there could be multiple tax benefits which are evolving, but that is something which has to be certified by the statutory auditor. So that's again is a very important auditing consideration, I would say. Of course, it's not an accounting one, but of course, there's a very important big auditing consideration there. Moving on, then it actually requires the financial information of the investment manager and sponsor. As I said, there is an investment manager who manages the whole business, the board thereof, and the sponsor. So their fast 3 years financials have to be given. Now, there could be situations where, let's say, the investment manager is from US and they follow US GAAP. So, so the financial information under US GAAP can't be added in our view. Then that's the case. You have to be brought down in IFRS. If there is a company which is from a country where there is an IFRS followed, but there are several carve-outs. Now, in that situation, those carve-outs have to be kind of taken off. But of course, there's no guidance in the InvIT regulations around that. But again, this has to be very similar or nearer to Ind AS or to IFRS in that sense. So this could be again a very extensive exercise, both for the auditor and the auditees, to look at, how do you provide the financial. Otherwise, it looks very simple, right? So to just say that there is a financial information, the balance sheets of investment manager and sponsors to be put. But sponsor could be from a country or a jurisdiction which does not follow IFRS. Now, what do we do? There could be, let's say some circle-ups which are required by the trust auditor, and they might want for a comfort letter from the, auditor of the investment manager sponsor, which could be a global company. Now, that is again a detailed exercise which can happen. How do you get the back-to-back comfort letters? So that again could be a very important consideration. Next one is, as I talked about, related parties. They are very extensively defined under the InvIT and REIT regulation. SEBI is very particular on this one, and they expect the companies to do a comprehensive disclosure of all the related parties, both as per the GAAP, the IFRS, Ind AS, or as well as the SEBI regulations. So that's something is again very important. Again, both the company has to look at this area as well as the auditors. So these are like, if you see, these are a lot of unique ones. You will not see all of them and many of them coming in a normal IPO or a normal company's audit. But these are again, very promising, as I said. Next one is like 3-4 specific issues I wanted to touch upon. One is around this whole classification of unit capital. So if you look at the regulations, they actually say that, there is a mandatory obligation to distribute 90% of the cash of InvIT to the unit holders. Now, what that would mean is that this is more like a compound financial instrument under Ind AS, and this has to be split into an equity and liability component. But SEBI, in their disclosure, only require unit capital to be given separately as a unit holder's equity. So there is an inconsistency between the Ind AS and what is there between SEBI circular. So right now, what we see, most of the trusts which are listed in the country, as I showed in the first slide, are following the SEBI circular, but the auditors are making a disclosure of that. So that is something which is a very typical issue in this one, that really this is not in compliance with Ind AS, because there is an obligation or a liability component which is sitting into the unit holders fund. Again, the related question then comes in, what happens to the accounting for distribution? So let's say a company which declared something in the month of April, May, June, or whatever. But then under the regulation, there is already an obligation that, the funds have to be distributed by 90% of the amount. If that is the case, should we not accrue this whole amount as at year end? Again, the problem is that because the SEBI circular requires this REIT and InvIT to show this unit capital as an equity, the position which is generally being taken is that this distribution will be recognized as a liability only when they are approved by the board. So which will be subsequent year. There could be next related question around what happens to the presentation of distributions, because the unique part is that in the InvIT regulation, the 90% distribution is not linked really to the accumulated profits only. This is linked to the share sale, it is linked to the repayment of loans and all of the other things. So it is not more based on the fund flow. Now, what that would mean is that there could be situations that the distribution could exceed the accumulated profit in the balance sheet. Now, what that means is that the distribution is more, but the accumulated profit are less. Now, where do we show this whole thing on the face? We have seen both the practices. Some people are showing the negative accumulated profits or retained earnings by showing more distribution. Some companies will actually reduce the distribution from the unit capital. So these are again, mixed practices, but that's something is a very typical issue which comes in. And in the first instance, it looks very funny that, we are distributing more than what really is the coming from the financial statement, which was more the companies had kind of an audit. We were all comfortable doing. The next one is around the business acquisition and asset acquisition. So, when you acquire an SPV, there is under Ind AS 103, there is a guidance around what would be constituted as a business. Recently, last year, there was an optional concentration test, which also came about, which actually defined and make it easier for companies that if substantially all the fair value of the asset is concentrated in a single identifiable asset, if that's the case, then you can actually consider it as an asset acquisition rather than a business. So, you would all know that under 103, business acquisition will give rise to a goodwill or a capital reserve. It would have deferred tax implications. So a lot of changes are there. The whole accounting changes based on business acquisition or asset acquisition. So a business combination would show a very different picture that way. That again is a very typical challenge in a REIT or an InvIT audits. If you look at contingent consideration, you might have it buy a SPV, but there's contingent consideration. So if it is a business combination, then Ind AS 103 gives some guidance about liability or equity. But if it is an asset acquisition, there is not enough guidance. So that could be again very challenging. An InvIT buys an SPV and says that this is the fixed consideration and this much is contingent. So how do you account for that contingent consideration? Whether you show it as an equity investment or you show it as a liability. So that's something has to be looked at from the standards perspective. The next one is service concession. Now, if you have really public-private partnership, this can be, instead of showing it as a fixed asset, let's say toll road is a classic example, which could possibly become an intangible asset or a financial asset instead of a fixed asset. Now, that's the whole new set of accounting under IFRS or Ind AS that has to be undertaken if it follows the service concession. So, and this is more relevant for this set of a business because in InvITs, this is more likely that you might, rather than REITs, but you'll find in InvITs that there could be more service concession arrangements could be there, because these are all kind of PPP kind of a thing. The last one is around the impairment of REIT and investment. So what happens is that, as I said, the interest is given by the SPV to the interest is paid on the debt by the SPV to the InvIT or a REIT. Now, what will happen is if there's a whole cash outflow keeps happening, the company and the acquisition happens by a REIT at the fair value. So there is always a risk that in case the business goes for a difficult time, there could be impairment. So let's say COVID comes in and a REIT or InvIT buys certain assets from an SPV or buy an SPV at a particular fair valuation, but suddenly because of business factors, government comes out with a new order where the concession agreement goes for a change. There could be COVID, which could impact the office level occupancies or vacancies. Now, these could change the fair valuations because you bought at a fair value, there could be a impairment trigger in that case. So that has to be again very closely watched out for in terms of the accounting and auditing, both by the company and the auditors. The last one I think I'm going to talk about is the control. What happens is that because, as I said, there is an investor and a sponsor, and there is an investment manager who controls the trust. Ind AS 110 gives the definition, but again, this is the most typical topic in terms of whether we will consolidate the trust or not really consolidated, whether if a sponsor or a unit holder holds more than 50% of the trust, and he also holds the, let's say, the 100% of the investment manager, will he consolidate? So these are some of the factors which were written on the slide, which has to be all looked at in totality to really figure out whether a trust is being consolidated with a particular group or not. So this is something which we have to see in terms of what is a contractual arrangement. Are there any kick-out rights between the unit holders? So those have to be looked at. The next one is the snapshot of how the offer document looks like. Of course, it has the general executive summary, risk factors, almost 1,000, very similar to an IPO document, but it has a lot of these details around MD&A, taxation, and we talk about. So this is the very simple document. I'll just kind of skip this. And The other one is around in terms of what are the practical aspects looked into by different stakeholders. So if you look at investment manager, what is the role of investment manager? Investment manager will make all the investment decisions. They will prepare the 3 years financial statement. They will look at every assumption which is made in the offer document. They will make sure that there are proper titles and there are proper legal contracts. So they pretty much, the board of the investment manager, in case of a REIT, it is called really a manager, because so they pretty much kind of run the whole business. They will appoint the auditors, they will appoint the registrar, they will appoint the merchant banker. They'll make sure the disclosures are right. They make sure the accounts are audited on timely basis. And then comes the role of a trustee. What is the trustee's role? Trustee will actually just ensure that the investment manager does this activity well. They will enter into an investment manager agreement. They will ensure timely distribution to the unit holders. They will just hold the investor assets on behalf of the unit holders. So they pretty much are the custodians, pretty much making sure the investment manager is doing the job well and in compliance with the regulations, but they don't have any day-to-day activity role or operating activity role. It is what an investment manager does, and an investment manager needs to have 50% of the board as independent directors. So this is how these two look at, and if you look at the other intermediaries, auditors, they look at assumptions, a very important piece we talked about, regulators, investors, sponsors. Sponsors, we talked about that they should also have a minimum holding post listing, so that they have to maintain. This is important piece. And I think the last slide here is about some of the opportunities. As I said, that as InvIT and REITs, the whole idea in a 45-minute session was to just to take you through in terms of what could be the key challenges. Of course, I'm not doing justice to the whole topic, but as you see a chartered accountant firms, you will have enough opportunities in the whole InvIT and REIT cycle. They could be helping companies with fundraise, they will helping business modeling. It could be valuation depending on your firm's expertise. If you are really a practitioner or any firm, it may not be really the audit. You can do due diligence. You can look at tax advisory. You can look at accounting, auditing, systems audit, internal audit. So they could be, all of those needs to be appointed. So as these InvITs and trusts REITs are getting prominence, there could be multiple opportunities. So, you will have to interact with the lead bankers, valuers, auditors, legal counsel, sponsor, investment manager, project manager. So all these parties have to take it, and maybe a CFO can act as a more like an advisor to the firm management in that basis. So with this, I will stop, and I hope I'm completed in the allotted time which was given to me. Thank you so much. Back to you, Deepak ji or Rohit ji.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Amit Gupta ji.
Thank you.
Sir, 2 questions there. ले लो sir.
हाँ जी, बिल्कुल.
Sir, can you please discuss the accounting treatment in the hand of unit holder? Unit holder company is Indian AS. Question उसमें point 1 कहता है whether FVTPL FVTOC1 2, what would be the treatment in the case of return of capital by InvIT?
Sorry, the question is not clear to me. Can you say that again, please?
Accounting treatment in the hand of unit holder. Unit holder company is on Indian AS, whether FVTPL oblique FVTOC 1 2. What would be treatment in case of return of capital by InvIT?
So it will be at FVTPL. So I think the unit holder will do it in FVTPL. They will do a fair value through profit and loss account of the unit.
So second, one of our client has invested in InvIT units. The InvIT distribute along with dividend and interest. It also distribute amortization amount, repayment of debt. Now at that time, we have to reduce the repayment of debt from the cost of investment or not. As the InvIT under its frequency specification, that it need not be reduced from the cost, as the Income Tax Act does not provide such reduction. Kindly clarify.
No, for book purposes, that will be reduced. So
Okay.
income tax will be separate. This accounting.
Sir, एक question और है. NDCF distributed by REIT will be debited to retained earning of REIT or debited to unit capital.
So I think, as I said, this could be done in both the cases. So again, I've seen a mixed practice in this one. Some people are reducing it. So till the point there is a retained earning, you will reduce it from that. If it is, retained earning becomes negative, then in that situation, I've seen companies taken to the unit capital, and I've seen companies who were shown it as a negative retained earning.
ठीक है सर, तो मैं यही कंक्लूड करता हूँ. थैंक यू वेरी मच सर. सर एक क्वेश्चन और आया है, सॉरी.
हाँ जी.
How REIT accounting is different from Ind AS Schedule 3 if SEBI allows say to follow Ind AS or Schedule 3?
Sorry, can you say that again, Deepak ji?
Sir, how REIT accounting is different from Ind AS / Schedule 3 if SEBI allow also say to follow Ind AS and Schedule 3?
No, so I think the as I said, it is pretty much same, because SEBI circular to an extent allows to follow Ind AS. I think only in the case of a unit capital, where we said that there is a differentiation, that because there is a mandatory requirement under regulations that 90% of the amount has to be distributed, the unit capital under Ind AS cannot be purely equity. It has to be a compound financial instrument. However, because the SEBI circular requires it to put it like a unit capital, that is how all the trusts are doing so. So to that extent, there is a little bit of anomaly, but other than that, there is not pretty much, it actually says you have to follow Ind AS, but that is coming all from a circular, not really from otherwise a guidance. But you're right that to an extent, Schedule 3 is being prescribed through the circular route, except for this difference I just talked about.
ठीक है सर. थैंक यू वेरी मच सर. अमित जी, काफी वंडरफुल सेशन था और मोर देन 1500 मेंबर इसके लिए रजिस्टर्ड थे सर.
ओके, थैंक यू सो मच दीपक जी. या, थैंक यू सो मच फॉर योर टाइम.
सर मैं यही कंक्लूड करता हूँ. थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर सर फॉर गिविंग अस टाइम फॉर टुडे वंडरफुल सेशन. थैंक यू अमित सर. थैंक यू वेरी मच. थैंक यू सी संदीप जी. थैंक यू अनिल जी फॉर टेक्निकल सपोर्ट एंड ऑल अदर गाइडेंस. थैंक यू चेयरमैन सर.
थैंक यू
एंड थैंक्स टू ऑल रिस्पेक्टेड पार्टिसिपेंट जिन्होंने जिनके सहयोग से ये सब सेशन संभव हो पाया. थैंक यू वेरी मच ईच एंड एवरीवन.
थैंक यू सो मच. बाय.
ठीक है अनिल जी, मैं कंक्लूड कर रहा हूँ यहीं पर.
या,
थैंक यू.